The imperial palace sits empty on September 4th, 476. 16-year-old Romulus Augustulus, his name, a cruel joke of history, combining Rome's legendary founder with its first emperor, stands in a marble corridor that has witnessed 1,000 years of power. Outside, Germanic warriors commanded by Odoacer wait. No battle will occur, no dramatic last stand. The boy who rules nothing will simply step aside, and the Senate will send the imperial regalia east to Constantinople, acknowledging what everyone already knows. The Western Roman Empire no longer exists. The marble beneath Romulus's feet was laid by craftsmen whose grandfathers learned their trade when Rome still commanded legions from Britain to Mesopotamia. Now those same stones echo with the footsteps of Gothic soldiers who wear Roman uniforms, carry Roman standards, and call themselves Romans, while speaking a Germanic tongue their grandparents brought from beyond the Danube. The palace slaves who attend Romulus this morning are the same ones who served his predecessor. They will serve Odoacer tomorrow. For them, this is not an ending, merely another change of master in a lifetime that has already seen too many. But here's what makes this moment strange. Almost no one at the time thought it mattered. Life in Italy continued. Odoacer ruled as Romans had ruled. The Senate still met. Aqueducts still carried water. Latin remained the language of administration. For the people living through it, September 4th, 476 felt like just another in a long series of political changes that had plagued the Western provinces for 2 centuries. We think of this moment as civilization collapsing, the ancient world ending, darkness falling. Contemporary Romans saw it as Tuesday. This gap between what we think happened and what actually happened sits at the heart of Rome's story. Because the question that has obsessed historians for 1,500 years, why did Rome fall, might be the wrong question entirely. In 1984, historian Alexander Demant catalogued 210 different theories proposed to explain Rome's collapse. 210: climate change, lead poisoning, moral decay, Christianity, paganism, too many immigrants, not enough immigrants, economic exhaustion, military spending, debasement of currency, soil depletion, cyclical historical forces, divine punishment, each theory supported by evidence, each championed by serious scholars, none conclusively proven. What if Rome didn't fall the way we imagine? What if understanding why Rome matters requires abandoning the dramatic narrative of collapse we've constructed and examining something more complex? How a small settlement of Latin farmers beside the Tiber River built an empire that controlled the entire Mediterranean world, created systems of law and governance that structure our modern lives, and transformed so gradually into something else that the people living through the change barely noticed it was happening. This is the story not of how Rome fell, but of how Rome was built, what it actually was, and why the question of its ending has obsessed us for so long that we've created 210 different answers. Before we journey into that story, I want to ask something of you. If you're finding this exploration worthwhile, take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support genuinely makes this work possible, and I'm curious, where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop a comment and let me know. There's something powerful about knowing this story connects people across continents, much like Rome once did. Now, let's begin at the actual beginning, which is messier and stranger than the legend suggests. The story Romans told themselves started with divine rape, fratricide, and wolves. Mars, god of war, assaults the Vestal Virgin Rhea Silvia. She bears twin sons, Romulus and Remus. The boys are abandoned, suckled by a she-wolf, raised by a shepherd, and eventually found a city. Romulus kills Remus in a dispute over its boundaries. On April 20th, 753 BCE, Rome begins with blood and the favor of gods. It's a good story. Archaeology tells a different one. The 7 hills beside the Tiber River show evidence of human settlement stretching back to the 10th century BCE, scattered clusters of huts, not a single founding moment. These were Latin tribes, culturally similar to dozens of other communities throughout central Italy. They farmed the fertile volcanic soil, raised livestock, and lived in thatched-roofed dwellings that left circular foundation marks in the earth. Above them, more sophisticated Etruscan city-states dominated northern Italy with their own writing system, religious practices, and artistic traditions. To the south, Greek colonies had established themselves in Sicily and southern Italy, bringing Mediterranean culture to the Italian peninsula. Archaeological excavations on the Palatine Hill reveal layers of occupation that tell a story more gradual than any founding myth. The earliest inhabitants lived in oval huts with wattle and daub walls, their floors dug slightly into the earth for insulation. They cremated their dead and buried the ashes in ceramic urns. They made pottery on slow wheels, worked bronze into tools and ornaments, and traded with neighboring communities for salt from the coastal marshes and obsidian from distant volcanic islands. These early Latins weren't primitive. They understood crop rotation, animal husbandry, and seasonal migration to upland pastures. They had religious specialists who read the will of gods in the flight of birds and the entrails of sacrificed animals. They formed kinship networks that extended beyond individual villages, gathering for seasonal festivals where young people married, disputes were arbitrated, and collective decisions made. They were one small community among hundreds dotting the Italian landscape, distinguished by nothing except geography. Early Rome wasn't special. It was one settlement among many, distinguished mainly by its location, defensible hills above a fordable point on the Tiber, at the intersection of trade routes running north-south and inland coastal. Geography, not divine destiny, made Rome possible. The Tiber ford mattered more than any legendary she-wolf. North-south trade between Etruscan cities and Greek colonies had to cross the river somewhere. East-west trade from coastal salt pans to interior farming communities needed the same. The Seven Hills provided defensible high ground above the river's floodplain. The location invited settlement not because gods favored it, but because merchants needed it. Sometime in the 7th century BCE, these hill settlements began merging into a single urban center. The swampy valley between the hills was drained and became the Forum, the public space that would remain Rome's heart for 1,000 years. Walls were built. Temples were raised. The settlement transformed from a collection of villages into something recognizable as a city. This transformation wasn't unique to Rome. Across central Italy, villages were coalescing into cities during the same period. The Etruscans to the north had already urbanized. Greeks in the south brought urban planning traditions from the eastern Mediterranean. Rome's urbanization was part of a broader cultural shift, not an isolated development. The drainage of the Forum Valley was an engineering project that required coordinated labor beyond any single village's capacity. Someone organized that labor, someone designed the drainage system, someone had authority to compel cooperation. This is where Rome's kings enter history, not as legendary figures descended from gods, but as the powerful leaders who organized early Roman society. Romans later claimed this period was ruled by 7 kings, starting with Romulus. The list feels suspiciously neat, 7 kings ruling from 753 to 509 BCE averages to 35 years per reign, mathematically convenient but biologically unlikely. The last 3 kings bear Etruscan names, suggesting Etruscan dominance over early Rome. The final king, Tarquin the Proud, supposedly became such a tyrant that Romans overthrew the monarchy entirely in 509 BCE and established a republic where power would be shared among citizens rather than concentrated in one man. The Etruscan connection reveals something important about early Rome. It was culturally derivative, not original. The Etruscans taught Romans their alphabet, adapted from Greek. Etruscan religious practices, augury, divination, elaborate funerary rituals, became Roman practices. The gladiatorial games that would define Roman entertainment originated as Etruscan funeral rites. Even the symbols of Roman authority, the fasces, bundles of rods with an axe that represented the power to beat and execute, came from Etruscan magistrates. Rome's genius in these early centuries wasn't cultural innovation, it was cultural absorption. Romans took what worked from Etruscans, Greeks, and other neighbors, adapted it to their purposes, and claimed it as their own. This pattern of pragmatic adoption would characterize Roman expansion for centuries. Whether the specific kings existed matters less than what the story reveals about Roman psychology. They constructed an origin myth that explained their hatred of kings, their republican institutions, and their belief that Rome had always been destined for greatness. The she-wolf nursing Romulus and Remus became their symbol, ferocity tempered by nurturing, wildness domesticated into civic purpose. The rape of Lucretia, the event that allegedly triggered the monarchy's overthrow, became Rome's foundational political story. Lucretia, a virtuous Roman matron, was raped by Sextus Tarquinius, son of King Tarquin the Proud. She revealed the crime to her father and husband, demanded they avenge her honor, then stabbed herself to death. Her male relatives, led by Lucius Junius Brutus, raised a rebellion, expelled the Tarquins, and established the Republic. The story is almost certainly false as historical fact, but it's true as cultural revelation. It tells us Romans believed that tyranny corrupted even family bonds, that personal honor mattered more than life, that women's virtue was the foundation of civic order, and that Romans would sacrifice anything, even kings, to preserve liberty. These beliefs, whatever their historical basis, shaped how Romans understood themselves. But the real story of Rome's rise isn't about divine favor or legendary founders. It's about geography, timing, and a social structure that turned military service into the path to citizenship. Early Republican Rome organized itself around a fundamental division, patricians and plebeians. Patricians were the hereditary aristocracy, families who claimed descent from Rome's original settlers. They monopolized political office, religious positions, and ownership of the best land. Plebeians were everyone else, small farmers, artisans, merchants, the urban poor. They outnumbered patricians vastly but held no formal political power. This created constant tension, what Romans called the struggle of the orders. Plebeians had two sources of leverage: their labor, which the city needed, and their military service, which the state required for survival. In 494 BCE, plebeians staged the first recorded labor strike in Western history, withdrawing to a hill outside Rome and refusing to return until granted political representation. The Senate capitulated, allowing plebeians to elect tribunes who could veto patrician legislation. The story of the first secession, preserved by the historian Livy, includes a revealing parable. A patrician senator named Menenius Agrippa was sent to negotiate with the striking plebeians. He told them a fable. Once, the parts of the human body rebelled against the belly, which seemed to do no work while receiving all the food. The hands, feet, and mouth went on strike, refusing to feed the belly. Soon they all grew weak and realized the belly's work, digesting food and distributing nourishment, was essential to the whole. The moral: patricians and plebeians needed each other. The plebeians returned to Rome, but they didn't forget the lesson's corollary. They had power. Withholding labor and military service could force concessions. This would happen repeatedly. This pattern repeated for 2 centuries. Plebeians demanded rights, patricians resisted, military needs forced compromise. Gradually, plebeians gained access to political office, the right to marry patricians, and formal legal protections. In 451–450 BCE, Rome's laws were codified in the 12 Tables, bronze tablets displayed in the Forum so all citizens could know their rights. The laws seem harsh to modern eyes. Debtors could be sold into slavery, thieves could be executed, but the act of writing them down, making them public and unchangeable by patrician whim, was revolutionary. The 12 Tables included provisions both brutal and surprisingly progressive. If a father sells his son 3 times, the son shall be free from the father. This suggests debt bondage was common enough to require regulation. If a person has maimed another's limb, Let there be retaliation in kind unless he makes agreement for compensation with him. This is lex talionis, eye for an eye, but with provision for negotiated settlement. Whoever is convicted of giving false witness shall be hurled from the Tarpeian rock. And this established that perjury was among the gravest crimes, equivalent to murder or treason. These laws weren't humanitarian by modern standards. They reflected a society where patriarchal authority was nearly absolute, where physical punishment was routine, where status determined rights. But they were public, knowable, and theoretically applicable to all citizens. That mattered. Rome's genius wasn't military at first, it was this: creating a system where ambitious men from lower orders could gain status through service to the state, where victory in war brought rewards distributed broadly enough to maintain social cohesion, and where military service made you a stakeholder in Rome's success. Other Italian cities had similar systems. Rome simply did it better, more consistently, and with greater willingness to extend citizenship to conquered peoples. By the 4th century BCE, Rome had defeated or absorbed its Latin neighbours and turned toward the Etruscan cities to the north. In 396 BCE, after a 10-year siege, Rome captured the Etruscan city of Veii. This conquest marked Rome's transformation from local power to regional force. Veii's territory doubled Rome's land. More importantly, it established a pattern that would define Roman expansion: methodical, relentless, and focused on permanent incorporation rather than temporary dominance. The siege of Veii lasted so long that Roman soldiers, normally citizen farmers, who returned home after campaigning season, remained in the field through winter for the first time. To maintain their service, Rome began paying them. This small change had enormous consequences. Professional military service, even part-time, created economic incentives for expansion. Soldiers needed pay. Pay came from conquest. Conquest required more soldiers. The cycle was self-reinforcing, but Rome's rise wasn't inevitable. In 390 BCE, Gallic tribes from the north swept down into Italy, crushed the Roman army at the Battle of Allia, and sacked Rome itself. Romans fled to the Capitoline Hill, the city's citadel. According to legend, the attacking Gauls were about to breach the final defences when sacred geese began honking, alerting the guards. The garrison held. Eventually, Romans paid the Gauls to leave. The story of the geese is probably false. The lesson Romans drew from it was genuine. Rome survived not through strength but through stubbornness, the refusal to surrender even in catastrophe. They rebuilt. They fortified. They continued expanding. The Gallic sack traumatized Rome in ways that shaped its strategic culture for centuries. Romans built new defensive walls, the Servian walls, eventually enclosing 427 hectares, far larger than the city then required. This was forward-thinking defense or paranoid overbuilding, depending on perspective. Romans developed a visceral fear of Gallic warfare, remembered in their literature and political rhetoric for generations. And Romans internalized a lesson: never again would they allow foreign enemies to threaten the city itself. The best defense was expansion that pushed potential threats far from Rome's walls. Over the next century, Rome fought a series of wars that gave it control of the Italian peninsula. The Samnite Wars, 3 separate conflicts between 343 and 290 BCE, pitted Rome against the powerful Samnite Confederation controlling the Apennine Mountains. The wars were brutal, inconclusive for long periods, and ultimately won through Rome's ability to absorb losses that would have broken other states. Samnites could win battles. Rome could lose battles and return the next year with fresh legions. The Second Samnite War included one of Rome's most humiliating defeats. In 321 BCE, Roman forces marched into the Caudine Forks, a narrow mountain pass. Samnites blocked both ends, trapping the Roman army without battle. The Samnite commander, Gavius Pontius, forced the Romans to pass under a yoke, a humiliating ritual signifying surrender and subjugation. The Senate refused to honor the peace treaty the trapped commanders had negotiated. Rome returned to war, eventually defeating the Samnites through sheer attrition. This pattern, refuse humiliation, accept enormous losses, grind down enemies through inexhaustible manpower became Rome's strategic signature. Other ancient powers might accept negotiated settlements. Rome sought total victory, or fought until achieving it. By 275 BCE, Rome controlled all of Italy south of the Po River, but control through Rome was different from conquest by other ancient powers. Rome didn't simply extract tribute and leave local governance intact. It created a complex web of alliances, colonies, and citizenship grants that tied Italian communities to Rome's success. Some cities received full citizenship. Others received citizenship without voting rights. Still others remained formally independent but bound by alliance. Roman colonies, settlements of Roman citizens, were planted in strategic locations, creating networks of people whose interests aligned with Rome's. This system meant that when Rome went to war, it could field armies drawn not just from Rome itself, but from allied Italian cities obligated to provide troops. Other Mediterranean powers, Carthage, the Hellenistic kingdoms that had emerged from Alexander's empire, commanded more territory and wealth. Rome commanded more soldiers. And those soldiers, crucially, believed they were fighting for their own stake in the system. Then Rome made the decision that would change everything. It went to war with Carthage. Carthage controlled the western Mediterranean from its base in North Africa. Founded by Phoenician colonists from the Levantine coast, Carthage had become a maritime power whose fleet dominated trade routes and whose wealth exceeded any Italian city-state. Carthage had colonies in Spain, Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. Its government was oligarchic, controlled by merchant aristocrats. Its military relied heavily on mercenaries rather than citizen soldiers. The contrast between Roman and Carthaginian military systems reveals different social structures. Rome's legions consisted primarily of property-owning citizen farmers who served because citizenship required it. They had economic stakes in Roman territory, family connections in Italian communities, and religious ties to Roman gods. Carthage's armies consisted of professional soldiers from across the Mediterranean, Numidian cavalry, Balearic slingers, Spanish infantry, Greek mercenaries. They fought for pay, not patriotism. This difference would prove decisive, though not in the way you might expect. Mercenaries could be superb soldiers, often more skilled than citizen militia, but they needed to be paid, and payment required continuous success. A mercenary army that lost, that couldn't provide plunder, that faced extended campaigns without reward, was an army on the verge of mutiny. Carthage would discover this painfully. In 264 BCE, a dispute over the Sicilian city of Messana drew Rome and Carthage into conflict. Rome had no navy. Its military experience consisted of land warfare in Italy. Carthage was the Mediterranean's dominant naval power. The mismatch seemed obvious. What happened next revealed something essential about Roman capability. Rather than accept naval inferiority, Rome built a fleet. According to the historian Polybius, Romans captured a wrecked Carthaginian warship, used it as a template, and constructed 100 copies in 60 days. The ships were crude. Roman sailors were inexperienced, so Romans invented the corvus, a boarding bridge that locked onto enemy vessels, transforming naval combat into land warfare where Roman infantry superiority mattered. The corvus was a hinged gangplank with a heavy spike on the end. When a Roman ship approached an enemy vessel, sailors dropped the corvus. The spike embedded in the enemy deck, locking the ships together. Roman soldiers then charged across, turning a sea battle into a land battle. It was ungainly, it made Roman ships top-heavy and dangerous in storms, but it worked. The First Punic War lasted 23 years. Both sides exhausted themselves. Rome lost entire fleets to storms, sometimes hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of men at once. Carthage lost battles, territory, and eventually the war. In 241 BCE, Carthage sued for peace, surrendering Sicily and paying indemnity. Rome had its first overseas province. The peace didn't hold. Carthage rebuilt under the Barcid family, first Hamilcar Barca, then his son-in-law Hasdrubal, then his son Hannibal. They created a Carthaginian empire in Spain, recruiting Iberian warriors and Spanish silver to restore Carthaginian power. In 218 BCE, Hannibal marched an army from Spain across southern Gaul, over the Alps and into Italy. Hannibal's crossing of the Alps became one of history's legendary military achievements. He began with approximately 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants. The exact route remains debated, but the ordeal was horrific. Alpine tribes attacked stragglers. Mountain passes were narrow, icy, and treacherous. Elephants, animals adapted to North African heat, suffered in the cold. Landslides and avalanches killed hundreds. When Hannibal reached the Po Valley, he had 20,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, and a single elephant surviving. But he had achieved surprise. Romans expected war in Spain or Sicily. Instead, Carthage's greatest general stood in northern Italy with an army, recruiting disaffected Gallic tribes to his cause. What followed is the closest Rome came to annihilation as a state. Hannibal wasn't just a brilliant tactician. He understood Rome's system and sought to destroy it by breaking the Italian alliance network. At the Trebia River, Lake Trasimene, and especially at Cannae in 216 BCE, Hannibal shattered Roman armies. At Cannae, he surrounded and destroyed a force of 80 Zeu'al Romans in what remains one of history's most devastating battlefield victories. 50,000 Romans died in a single afternoon. The consul Varro escaped. The other consul, Paulus, died with his men. The Battle of Cannae deserves detailed examination because it was a masterpiece of tactical brilliance. Hannibal arrayed his forces with weak center and strong flanks, Gallic and Spanish infantry in the center, African heavy infantry on the flanks, cavalry on the wings. Romans attacked the center, which Hannibal had designed to bulge forward, then gradually retreat, drawing Romans deeper. As the Roman formation pushed forward, Hannibal's African infantry wheeled inward, attacking the Roman flanks. Simultaneously, Hannibal's cavalry defeated the Roman cavalry and attacked the Roman rear. Romans were surrounded in a tightening noose. Packed too tightly to maneuver, unable to retreat, they were systematically slaughtered. Roman military thinkers studied Cannae for centuries. It became the template for the perfect battle: total envelopment, total destruction. Prussian military theorist Alfred von Schlieffen studied it when planning Germany's World War I strategy. The US Army taught it at West Point. It remains the gold standard of tactical annihilation. After Cannae, some Italian allies defected to Hannibal. The Samnites, still resentful of Roman conquest, joined him. So did Capua, southern Italy's largest city. Hannibal's army occupied Italian territory for 15 years, devastating the countryside and challenging Rome's supremacy. Rome should have negotiated. Every conventional strategic calculation suggested seeking terms. Instead, Rome refused. The Senate declared it illegal to even discuss peace with Hannibal while his army remained in Italy. They raised new legions from slaves and boys. They changed tactics, avoiding direct battle and attacking Hannibal's allies instead. And they did what would become Rome's signature strategic move. They counterattacked at the source, sending Publius Cornelius Scipio to invade Africa. The Roman response to Cannae reveals their strategic culture more clearly than any victory. In the immediate aftermath, with perhaps 1/4 of Rome's adult male citizens dead, the Senate ordered a census. They needed to know how many men remained. They instituted new taxes, melted down gold from temples, and bought slaves to free them for military service. Women donated jewelry, the wealthy funded ships and equipment. And crucially, Rome's Italian allies, most of them, remained loyal. Why? Because Rome had spent centuries integrating Italian communities into its system. Those communities had land distributions, citizenship rights, trading relationships, intermarriages with Roman families. Breaking from Rome meant losing all that. Hannibal offered freedom from Roman domination. But Rome had made domination feel like partnership to enough communities that the alliance held. Scipio landed near Carthage in 204 BCE. Hannibal was recalled from Italy to defend the homeland. In 202 BCE at Zama, Scipio defeated Hannibal using Hannibal's own tactics against him. Carthage surrendered, paid massive indemnities, surrendered its fleet, and agreed never to wage war without Roman permission. Rome now controlled not just Italy but also Spain, Sicily, Sardinia, and effectively dominated the Western Mediterranean. The victory revealed something about Roman culture that would shape its next 4 centuries. Rome didn't just want to win wars, it wanted total victory, complete submission, the permanent elimination of threats. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was the logical extension of a worldview that saw compromise as temporary and conflict as inevitable unless enemies were so thoroughly defeated they could never rise again. This psychology drove Rome's eastern expansion. In 200 BCE, Rome went to war with Macedonia, then Syria, then more wars with Macedonia. Each conflict drew Rome deeper into the complex politics of the Hellenistic East, where Greek-speaking kingdoms controlled territories Alexander had conquered. Romans initially claimed they were liberating Greeks from Macedonian tyranny. By 146 BCE, Rome had destroyed Corinth, made Greece a province, and ended the fiction that these were wars of liberation. The destruction of Corinth demonstrated Rome's capacity for calculated brutality. Corinth was one of Greece's wealthiest cities, strategically positioned on the isthmus controlling land traffic between northern and southern Greece. After defeating a Greek rebellion, Roman consul Lucius Mummius sacked the city methodically. Men were killed or sold into slavery. Women and children were enslaved. Buildings were demolished. Artworks were shipped to Rome. Mummius allegedly told the shipping contractors that if they lost or damaged the masterpieces, they would have to replace them with new ones, revealing his utter incomprehension of their cultural value. The city was abandoned, its territory made public land. Corinth would not be resettled for a century. Romans later felt some shame about Corinth. The destruction was so complete, so final, that even by Roman standards it seemed excessive. But in the moment, it sent a clear message. Rebellion against Rome, even by culturally sophisticated Greeks, would be met with annihilation. That same year, 146 BCE, Rome completed its destruction of Carthage. The Third Punic War wasn't really a war. Carthage had been militarily broken for decades. But Romans, led by Scipio Aemilianus, besieged Carthage, captured it, killed or enslaved its population, demolished its buildings, and allegedly sowed the ruins with salt so nothing would grow. Whether the salt story is true matters less than what Romans believed. Threats must be eliminated completely. By 146 BCE, Rome controlled the Mediterranean. No power could challenge it. This created a problem Rome's republican system couldn't solve. What does a state organized around competitive military service do when there are no more nearby enemies to fight? The answer was that it turned on itself. The century following Rome's Mediterranean dominance, roughly 133 to 27 BCE, was the Republic's slow-motion collapse. The immediate cause was economic. Conquest brought enormous wealth to Rome, but it concentrated in the hands of the senatorial aristocracy. Successful generals became obscenely rich through plunder. They bought up Italian farmland, creating vast estates worked by slaves captured in war. Small farmers who had formed the backbone of Rome's legions couldn't compete. Many sold their land and drifted to Rome, swelling the urban poor. The transformation of Italian agriculture had enormous social consequences. Traditional Roman virtue celebrated the citizen farmer-soldier, a man who owned his plot of land, raised crops and family, served in the legions when needed, and returned to his farm afterward. This figure was both reality and ideal for early Republican Rome. But war captives provided cheap slave labor. Wealthy Romans bought land, created latifundia, large estates, and used slave gangs for cultivation. Free farmers couldn't compete with free labor. These displaced farmers moved to Rome, where they formed a new social class, the urban poor, the proletarii, citizens whose only contribution to the state was children. They lived in insulae, multi-story apartment buildings that were crowded, unsanitary fire traps. They survived on occasional wage labor, handouts from wealthy patrons, and increasingly subsidized grain from the state. They had no economic stake in the system but retained voting rights. Politicians could court their votes with promises of land, grain, or cash. This created new political dynamics that the Senate, designed for a small city-state, couldn't manage. In 133 BCE, Tribune Tiberius Gracchus proposed land reform, redistributing public land to landless citizens. The Senate opposed him. When Tiberius sought an unprecedented second tribunate to continue his reforms, a mob of senators and their supporters beat him to death with wooden chair legs on the Capitoline Hill. It was the first political murder in Rome in nearly 400 years. 10 years later, Tiberius's brother Gaius Gracchus became tribune and proposed even more radical reforms: grain subsidies for the urban poor, extending citizenship to Italian allies, founding colonies for landless Romans. The Senate responded by passing what amounted to martial law. Gaius and thousands of his supporters were killed. Their bodies were thrown into the Tiber. The Gracchi brothers' deaths established a pattern that would define the next century. Reformers proposing changes to address genuine problems, conservative senators resisting through violence, and ambitious military commanders realizing that loyal armies were more powerful than senatorial votes. Gaius Marius came from outside the traditional aristocracy. He rose through military competence, becoming consul in 107 BCE. Facing a war in North Africa and invasions by Germanic tribes from the north, Marius made a crucial change. He recruited soldiers from the landless poor, promising them land grants upon retirement. Previously, only property-owning citizens could serve in the legions. Now, professional soldiers with no economic stake outside their general's success filled the ranks. The legions became loyal not to Rome, but to their commanders. Generals needed conquests to reward their troops. The state needed generals to defend its borders. The Senate controlled neither effectively. The system was breaking. Marius recruited from the capiti censi citizens counted by head, not by property, because they owned nothing. These men had no farms to return to, no businesses waiting for them. Military service wasn't a civic duty performed between harvests. It was a career, their only path to economic security. They needed their general to secure them land grants, bonuses, pensions. Loyalty flowed to whoever could deliver those rewards, not to abstract concepts like Senate and people of Rome. Marius himself demonstrated the new reality. He was elected consul an unprecedented 7 times, violating traditional term limits. He commanded armies that were loyal to him personally, and when political enemies threatened him, his veterans rioted in Rome's streets. The Republic's institutions, annual magistracies, term limits, Senate authority, were becoming suggestions that powerful men ignored when convenient. Lucius Cornelius Sulla was a patrician, a conservative, and a brilliant general who had served under Marius. When the Senate gave him command of a campaign against King Mithridates of Pontus in 88 BCE, then transferred the command to Marius, Sulla did something unprecedented. He marched his legions on Rome itself. The Senate capitulated. Marius fled. Sulla departed for his eastern campaign. Sulla's march on Rome crossed a psychological barrier that could never be restored. Roman legions had fought foreign enemies, sometimes fellow Italians, but never Rome itself. The city was sacred, protected by religious prohibition against armed soldiers crossing its boundary. Sulla and his soldiers violated that prohibition. They justified it by claiming they were saving the Republic from Marius's tyranny. But justification didn't erase the fact if you commanded loyal legions you could seize Rome by force. Every ambitious general learned that lesson. While Sulla fought Mithridates, Marius returned, seized Rome, and slaughtered his enemies. When Sulla returned in 83 BCE, he marched on Rome again, defeated Marius's forces and instituted proscriptions, public death lists of his political enemies whose property would be confiscated and whose killers would be rewarded. Thousands died. The young Julius Caesar nearly made the list before powerful friends interceded. Sulla made himself dictator, not the temporary emergency magistracy that office had traditionally been, but an indefinite autocracy. He enacted constitutional reforms designed to strengthen the Senate and limit populist tribunes. Then, bizarrely, he resigned, retired to his villa, and died of natural causes in 78 BCE. His reforms lasted approximately as long as he did. The pattern was set. Military commanders with loyal armies could overthrow the state. Constitutional norms were unenforceable against legions. The Republic had perhaps 50 years left, but it was already dead in every practical sense. The question wasn't whether Rome would become an autocracy, but which general would win the competition. Three men emerged as contenders. Marcus Licinius Crassus was Rome's richest man, having made his fortune in real estate and war profiteering. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, was Rome's most successful general, having defeated Mithridates, conquered much of the eastern Mediterranean, and established himself as the Senate's champion. And Gaius Julius Caesar was a patrician with populist politics, brilliant oratory, massive debts, and burning ambition. Crassus made his fortune through ruthless exploitation of crisis. He created Rome's first fire brigade, but didn't fight fires for free. When a building burned, Crassus would arrive and offer to buy the property at a fraction of its value. If the owner refused, Crassus would watch it burn. If they agreed, Crassus would extinguish the fire and acquire the property cheaply. He also bought the property of proscribed men, those on Sulla's death lists, at confiscation auctions. He loaned money to ambitious politicians at generous terms, building political debts. He was wealthy beyond measure, and despised for how he became wealthy. Pompey earned his cognomen Magnus, the Great, through military success. He defeated Marian forces in Sicily and Africa as a young man. He suppressed the slave revolt led by Spartacus, though the actual defeat was won by Crassus. Pompey arrived in time to claim credit. He cleared pirates from the Mediterranean in a brilliantly organized campaign. He conquered Pontus, Syria, and Jerusalem, reorganizing the East into Roman provinces and client kingdoms. He returned to Rome as its most celebrated general, expecting the Senate to grant his veterans land and ratify his Eastern arrangements. The Senate, jealous of his power, refused. Caesar was heavily in debt, having spent lavishly on public games and gifts to curry popular support. He needed a military command where he could win glory and loot to repay creditors. He had political genius, but no army. Pompey had an army, but political enemies. Crassus had money, but no military glory. Each had what the others needed. In 60 BCE, they formed an informal alliance, the First Triumvirate. It wasn't a legal magistracy, but a private agreement to coordinate their influence. Pompey needed land for his veterans. Crassus wanted tax reforms for his business interests. Caesar wanted a military command where he could win glory and wealth. They used their combined power to achieve these goals, bypassing senatorial opposition. Caesar received the governorship of Cisalpine Gaul and Transalpine Gaul, northern Italy and southern France. For 9 years, from 58 to 50 BCE, he conquered the rest of Gaul, reaching the Rhine and briefly crossing into Britain. His commentaries on these campaigns, written in third person with false modesty, describe systematic subjugation involving dozens of battles and the deaths or enslavement of perhaps 1 million Gauls. Modern historians debate whether his numbers were exaggerated. They don't debate that the Gallic Wars were genocidal in scale. Caesar's Gallic campaigns included moments of extraordinary brutality. When the Gallic tribe of the Atuatuci surrendered, Caesar sold 53 Zizozero people, men, women, children, into slavery in a single auction. When Germanic tribes crossed the Rhine seeking land in Gaul, Caesar met with their ambassadors under flag of truce, then seized them and attacked their camp while leaderless, killing and enslaving thousands. When the Gallic fortress of Avaricum fell after a siege, Caesar's soldiers, angry at their losses, massacred nearly 40 Ciudad inhabitants. Of a population of 40 Ciudad, Caesar's account claims 800 survived, but Caesar also showed strategic brilliance. The siege of Alesia in 52 BCE stands as one of history's great military operations. The Gallic chieftain Vercingetorix fortified Alesia with 80 Zizozan warriors. Caesar surrounded the fortress with a siege wall, 11 miles of fortifications including ramparts, ditches, towers and traps. When a Gallic relief army of perhaps 250 Ursularan warriors arrived to break the siege, Caesar built a second wall facing outward, another 14 miles of fortifications. Caesar's 60 Roman legionaries were now between two enemy forces protected by walls on both sides. They held both walls, defeated both armies, and captured Vercingetorix. The double siege remains a marvel of engineering and nerve. Caesar returned from Gaul, rich, famous, and commanding legions fanatically loyal to him. The Senate, led by Pompey, who had broken with Caesar, demanded he disband his army before entering Italy. Caesar faced a choice: obey and likely face prosecution by his enemies, or cross the Rubicon River, the boundary of Italy proper, with his army, which would be treason. On January 10th, 49 BCE, Caesar crossed the Rubicon. According to tradition, he quoted a Greek phrase, "The die is cast." By crossing, he made civil war inevitable. The war lasted 4 years. Caesar defeated Pompey at Pharsalus in 48 BCE. Pompey fled to Egypt, where he was murdered by advisors to the boy king Ptolemy VIII. Caesar followed, became involved in Egyptian dynastic politics, and began an affair with Cleopatra VII that would have its own historical consequences. Caesar defeated remaining senatorial forces in North Africa and Spain, returned to Rome, and made himself dictator. Unlike Sulla, Caesar didn't resign. He enacted reforms, calendar reform that created the Julian calendar still underlying our modern one, debt relief, veteran settlements, expansion of citizenship, plans for massive public works. He also began accumulating honors that looked suspiciously monarchical: lifetime dictatorship, the month of July named after him, his image on coins. Caesar's reforms addressed real problems but concentrated power absolutely in his hands. He expanded the Senate from 600 to 900 members, filling it with his supporters, including Gauls and other provincials. This diluted the old aristocracy's power while seeming democratic. He settled veterans in colonies throughout the empire, extending Roman citizenship and creating loyal populations. He reformed the calendar because the old lunar calendar had drifted out of sync with seasons. Priests had manipulated intercalary months for political purposes. Caesar's solar calendar, based on Egyptian models, restored order and, incidentally, demonstrated that he could reorganize time itself. But the honors revealed his ambitions, or at least his enemies' fears. Statues of Caesar appeared in temples alongside gods. He was granted the right to wear triumphal regalia at public events. His face appeared on coins, unprecedented for a living Roman. Senators voted him honors, trying to bind him through gratitude or expose his monarchical ambitions. Caesar accepted them all. On March 15, 44 BCE, a group of senators led by Marcus Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus stabbed Caesar to death at the theatre of Pompey. He died of 23 wounds. Ancient sources claim his last words were, "Et tu, Brute?" Even you, Brutus? Shakespeare made the phrase famous. Contemporary sources don't confirm it. What matters is what the conspirators thought they were doing, saving the Republic by killing a tyrant. They miscalculated completely. The Republic wasn't saved. It was definitively ended. Caesar's assassination triggered another civil war, this time between the assassins and Caesar's allies. Caesar's will named his 18-year-old great-nephew Octavian as heir. Octavian allied with Caesar's lieutenant Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony, and another Caesarian, Marcus Lepidus, forming the Second Triumvirate. At Philippi in 42 BCE, the triumvirs defeated Brutus and Cassius, both of whom committed suicide. The Republic's last defenders were dead. Now the question was which triumvir would rule alone. Lepidus was sidelined by 36 BCE, retired to comfortable irrelevance. Antony controlled the East, where he became involved with Cleopatra politically and romantically. Octavian controlled the West and Italy. For several years they maintained an uneasy partition. Then Octavian launched a propaganda campaign portraying Antony as corrupted by Eastern decadence, dominated by a foreign queen, planning to move Rome's capital to Alexandria. Octavian's propaganda was brilliant character assassination. He claimed Antony was bewitched by Cleopatra, that he wore Eastern clothes, that he had abandoned Roman values for Egyptian luxury. He claimed Antony intended to give Roman provinces to Cleopatra's children, to foreign rulers. He leaked or fabricated Antony's will, which allegedly left bequests to Cleopatra's children and requested burial in Alexandria rather than Rome. Whether the will was authentic didn't matter. It confirmed Roman suspicions that Antony had gone native, that he valued Egypt over Rome. The propaganda worked because it tapped into Roman xenophobia and fear of Eastern cultures. Romans admired Greek culture, while disdaining Greeks as effete and untrustworthy. They valued Eastern luxury goods while despising Eastern despotism. Cleopatra represented everything Romans feared about the East, a powerful woman, foreign, wealthy, sophisticated, sexually autonomous. Antony's relationship with her confirmed he was no longer Roman. In 31 BCE, Octavian's fleet commanded by Marcus Agrippa defeated Antony and Cleopatra's forces at Actium off the coast of Greece. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt. The next year, Octavian invaded. Antony committed suicide. Cleopatra followed, allegedly by snakebite, though historians doubt this. Octavian annexed Egypt as his personal province. At 32 years old, he controlled the entire Roman world. What Octavian did next determined the next 3 centuries of Mediterranean history. He could have made himself king, established an open monarchy, and ruled through military force. Instead, he created something more subtle, a system that maintained the appearance of republican government while concentrating power absolutely in his hands. In January 27 BCE, Octavian appeared before the Senate and theatrically offered to resign all his powers and return Rome to senatorial rule. The Senate, properly coached, begged him to remain. He accepted, modestly agreeing to serve as princeps, first citizen. The Senate granted him a new name, Augustus, meaning revered or sacred. The month Sextilis was renamed August in his honor. Augustus claimed to have restored the Republic. He maintained the Senate, the consulship, all the traditional magistracies. He simply ensured that real power, military command, control of provinces containing legions, the treasury, the grain supply, the ability to veto legislation remained in his hands. Later, historians would call this system the Principate, meaning rule of the first citizen. It was monarchy disguised as republic, and it worked because Romans wanted it to work. After a century of civil wars, stability trumped republican purity. The genius of Augustus's settlement was that it gave everyone what they wanted. Senators retained dignity, status, and the appearance of authority. They could pursue traditional careers, the cursus honorum, and govern peaceful provinces. They couldn't command legions or threaten Augustus's power, but they could feel important. The people received peace, grain subsidies, and spectacular entertainments. They lost political agency, popular assemblies became ceremonial, but gained security. The army received regular pay, retirement bonuses, and veteran colonies. Soldiers served the state, not competing generals, and knew they would be rewarded. Augustus himself gained absolute power while avoiding the title and fate of king. He was princeps, first citizen among equals. He was imperator, commander. He held tribunician power, making his person sacred. He was Pontifex Maximus, chief priest. He accumulated all the authority he needed through traditional republican offices and honors, never calling himself king. Augustus ruled for 41 years until 14 CE. During that time, he transformed Rome from a city that, in his words, he found brick and left marble. He established a professional fire brigade. He created Rome's first police force. He reformed taxation, making it systematic rather than arbitrary. He established colonies for his veterans, settling them throughout the empire. He promoted marriage and childbearing among the upper classes. He attempted to revive traditional Roman religion. The marble transformation was literal. Augustus sponsored construction across Rome, temples, basilicas, forums, theatres. The Forum of Augustus, with its Temple of Mars Ultor, celebrated his victory over Caesar's assassins. The Ara Pacis, Altar of Peace, commemorated peace established by his victories. Theatres, baths, aqueducts, roads, all proclaimed Augustus's beneficence. Rome became an imperial capital worthy of its empire. Most importantly, he established peace. The Pax Romana, Roman peace, is conventionally dated from 27 BCE to 180 CE, 2 centuries when the Mediterranean world experienced no major wars between great powers. Yes, Rome fought constant small wars on its frontiers. Yes, there were civil conflicts during succession crises, but the core Mediterranean territories enjoyed unprecedented stability. Trade flourished, cities grew, population increased. The Greek geographer Strabo, writing under Augustus, marveled at how bandits had been cleared from the seas and roads. But the Pax Romana, we must note, was peace imposed by conquest and maintained by constant threat of force. The Syrian Jewish historian Josephus described how General Titus captured Jerusalem in 70 CE, slaughtering civilians and destroying the Second Temple. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing about Rome's British campaigns, attributed these words to the Caledonian chieftain Calgacus. They rob, butcher, plunder, and call it empire. They create a desolation and call it peace. At this tension between Rome's self-image as civilization's benefactor and the reality of its military domination runs through its entire history. Romans genuinely believed they brought order, law, and culture to barbarous peoples. Those peoples often experienced that gift as violent subjugation. Augustus's most lasting achievement might be establishing a succession system that worked well enough to maintain stability. He had no surviving sons. he adopted his stepson Tiberius, a competent but gloomy general. When Augustus died in 14 CE, Tiberius succeeded without civil war. The precedent was set. Emperors would rule for life, then designate successors, usually through adoption. The system worked variably. Tiberius ruled competently but became paranoid and reclusive, retiring to Capri. Caligula, his successor, may have been mad. Sources describe him declaring himself a god, planning to make his horse a consul, and committing random murders. Caligula was assassinated in 41 CE. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's bodyguards, found his uncle Claudius hiding behind a curtain and declared him emperor. Claudius, dismissed as a stammering fool by his family, turned out to be an effective administrator. He conquered southern Britain, added several provinces, and reformed Rome's bureaucracy. He was probably poisoned by his wife Agrippina in 54 CE, so her son Nero could become emperor. Nero started promisingly, guided by the philosopher Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus. Then he had his mother murdered, kicked his pregnant wife Poppaea to death, and according to hostile sources fiddled while Rome burned in the Great Fire of 64 CE. The fiddle story is false. Fiddles hadn't been invented. Nero was outside Rome when the fire started, and he actually organized relief efforts. But Nero blamed Christians for the fire, initiating the first major persecution, and that gave Christian writers motivation to blacken his reputation permanently. Nero's misrule led to revolt. In 68 CE, facing military rebellion, he committed suicide. The next year, 69 CE, is called the Year of the Four Emperors. Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian each claimed the throne. Vespasian I established the Flavian dynasty and brought stability. Vespasian was a soldier from a non-aristocratic background. His reign and those of his sons Titus and Domitian established that emperors didn't need patrician ancestry. They needed military support and administrative competence. Vespasian began construction of the Colosseum. Titus completed it and also dealt with the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE that buried Pompeii and Herculaneum. Domitian ruled effectively but became paranoid, was assassinated in 96 CE, and the Senate chose the elderly, childless senator Nerva to succeed him. Nerva made a crucial decision. Rather than let succession be contested upon his death, he adopted the most capable general, Trajan. When Nerva died in 98 CE, Trajan succeeded smoothly. This precedent, adoption of the most competent successor rather than relying on blood lineage, produced what historians call the five good emperors: Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus, Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. These five ruled from 96 to 180 CE, a period of prosperity, stability, and Rome's maximum extent. Trajan conquered Dacia, modern Romania, adding its gold and silver mines to Rome's treasury. His eastern campaigns reached Mesopotamia. The empire attained its greatest territorial extent in 117 CE, 5 million square kilometers from Britain to Syria, from the Rhine-Danube frontier to the Sahara. The historian Edward Gibbon would later argue that if a man could choose any period in history to live, he should pick the era of the Antonines. This was empire at its zenith. A merchant could travel from Britain to Syria using Roman roads protected by Roman law, trading in Roman currency, communicating in Latin or Greek. Cities across 3 continents enjoyed Roman architecture, aqueducts, baths, theatres, and amphitheatres. Provincial elites sent their sons to Rome for education, adopted Roman customs, and competed for imperial offices. The Mediterranean had become Mare Nostrum, our sea. To understand what this meant in daily life, imagine being that travelling merchant. You wake in Londinium, London, In a stone building with hypocaust heating, Roman central heating that circulates warm air under floors, you bathe in the public baths, a massive complex with cold, warm and hot pools, exercise yards and social spaces. You conduct business in Latin, the empire's commercial language, though locals still speak Celtic languages at home. The coins you use, denarii and sestertii, are accepted from Britain to Syria. Your goods are protected by Roman law. Bandits and pirates have been suppressed. The roads you travel were engineered for military movement but serve commerce equally. You travel south through Gaul, France, staying at mansiones, official rest houses spaced a day's journey apart along major roads. The roads themselves are engineering marvels, foundation of large stones, layers of smaller stones and gravel, cambered for drainage, bordered by ditches. They're built to last centuries. Many still exist today, buried under modern roads following identical routes. In cities along your route, you see amphitheatres for gladiatorial games, theatres for plays, circuses for chariot races. Aqueducts carry fresh water from distant springs, sometimes across valleys on massive stone arches. Public fountains provide free water. Public latrines serve communal needs, though the less said about Roman sanitation standards, the better. Bath complexes serve as community centres where people exercise, socialise and conduct business. Provincial cities competed to outdo each other in Roman grandeur. Wealthy local elites funded construction to gain prestige and political influence. A successful merchant might become a decurion city councillor responsible for tax collection and public works. It was expensive, you paid for public amenities from personal wealth, but it brought status, influence and the possibility that your sons might enter imperial service. Roman citizenship, once restricted to residents of Rome itself, now extended to millions across the empire. The Antonine Constitution of 212 CE would grant citizenship to all free inhabitants of the empire. This was partly pragmatic. Citizens paid different taxes than non-citizens, but it reflected Roman genius for integration. You could be born in Syria, educated in Athens, serve in the army in Britain, retire to a veteran colony in Spain, and die a Roman citizen having never seen Rome itself. The army was both empire's defender and its integrator. Legions stationed on frontiers recruited locally after initial conquests. A young man from Spain might join a legion, serve 25 years on the Danube frontier, learn Latin, adopt Roman customs, marry a local woman, and retire with citizenship for himself and his children. Auxiliary units, non-citizen troops, served alongside legions, received citizenship upon retirement, and provided specialized skills. Syrian archers, Numidian cavalry, Balearic slingers, Germanic infantry, the Roman military was as multicultural as the empire itself. Yet beneath this cosmopolitan surface, the empire remained profoundly stratified. Perhaps 10% of the population were citizens when Augustus died. The rest were subjects, provincials with varying degrees of rights. Slaves, perhaps 20 to 30% of Italy's population, less elsewhere, had no rights at all. They were property, bought and sold, used and discarded. Some slaves lived relatively well as skilled artisans, teachers, or household managers. Many toiled in mines, quarries, or agricultural estates under conditions of spectacular brutality. The economy rested on agriculture. Perhaps 90% of people worked the land. Large estates, latifundia, controlled by senatorial families, dominated Italy and parts of the provinces. Small farmers, the backbone of the early republic, increasingly gave way to concentrated landholding. In Egypt, Rome's breadbasket, the state controlled vast territories worked by tied peasants, little different from slaves. Rome itself consumed without producing. 1 million people lived in the city by the 1st century CE. They ate Egyptian grain shipped across the Mediterranean, Spanish olive oil, wine from Gaul. The grain dole, free wheat for citizens, fed perhaps 200,000 people. This wasn't charity, it was policy. The urban poor, landless and unemployed needed feeding to prevent riots. Bread and circuses and food and entertainment kept them docile. The entertainments were spectacular and horrifying. Gladiatorial games, originally Etruscan funeral rites, became massive public spectacles. The Colosseum seated 50 ucciasero. Gladiators fought to the death. Condemned criminals were executed in elaborate staged hunts or mythological reenactments. Christians were famously fed to lions, though persecution was sporadic, not continuous. Exotic animals, lions, tigers, elephants, crocodiles, were slaughtered in the arena by the hundreds. The Emperor Trajan's Dacian triumph featured games lasting 123 days with 10 ucciasero gladiators and 11 wild animals killed. We moderns find this barbaric. Romans saw it as demonstrating virtues, courage, and reminding citizens of Rome's power over life and death. Gladiators were celebrities. Some fought voluntarily for fame and fortune. The best earned freedom and wealth. Chariot racers were even more famous, commanding fees comparable to modern athletes. Fans formed factions, blues, greens, reds, whites, whose rivalries sometimes erupted into riots, killing hundreds. Roman religion was everywhere and nowhere, everywhere because religious ritual permeated civic life. Every public act began with augury, reading divine will in bird flight or animal entrails. Temples dominated city centres. Festivals marked the calendar. The emperor was Pontifex Maximus, chief priest. Yet nowhere, because Romans lacked religious faith as we understand it. Religion was transactional. Perform the proper rituals, the gods provide favour. No one much cared what you believed. This made Rome religiously tolerant by ancient standards. Conquered peoples could worship their gods freely, provided they also honoured Roman gods and the imperial cult, the deification of emperors. Most people complied. Jews and Christians refused, seeing it as idolatry, which made them troublesome. Early Christian persecution wasn't about theology but civic loyalty. Refusing to burn incense to the emperor's genius suggested disloyalty, even treason. Daily life in the empire varied enormously by region, class, and status. A senator in Rome lived in a domus, a spacious townhouse with atrium, gardens, private baths, and dozens of slaves. He wore a toga, that impractical garment of Roman citizenship, attended Senate meetings, hosted dinner parties where guests reclined on couches and ate elaborate multi-course meals. His wife, if wealthy, exercised surprising autonomy, managing household affairs, owning property, and influencing politics through her husband. A farmer in Egypt lived in a mud-brick dwelling, worked land he didn't own, paid crushing taxes to Roman officials and local elites, and might never see a Roman soldier or speak Latin. His wife worked beside him in fields, bore children who often died young, and had few legal rights. The empire's benefits, peace, roads, trade, touched his life only as demands for taxes paid in grain. A merchant in Antioch or Alexandria lived between these extremes. He might own a comfortable house, employ a few slaves, participate in local government, educate his sons in rhetoric and philosophy. He prayed to Greco-Roman gods, Eastern deities, or increasingly the Christian God. He benefited from empire's infrastructure while chafing under its taxes and bureaucracy. His identity was complex, Syrian or Egyptian ethnically, Greek culturally, Roman politically. Women's lives were constrained but not uniform. Roman law placed women under male authority, father, then husband, then eldest son. They couldn't vote or hold office, yet wealthy women controlled property, ran businesses, influenced politics, and exercised considerable autonomy. We have records of female merchants, landowners, and even physicians. Poor women worked alongside men in fields and workshops. Slave women suffered particular vulnerability to sexual exploitation by their masters. Childhood was dangerous. Perhaps half of children died before age 10. Those who survived began adult responsibilities early. Boys from elite families started formal education around 7, studying grammar, rhetoric, and philosophy. Girls received less formal education, learning household management. Children from working families learned their parents' trades. Child labor was universal. The concept of childhood as a protected period of development didn't exist. Life expectancy was perhaps 30 to 35 years at birth, but this is misleading. Infant and child mortality dragged down averages. If you survived to adulthood, you might live to 60 or beyond. Disease was constant. Malaria, tuberculosis, dysentery, and a host of parasitic infections killed routinely. Doctors existed but had limited effectiveness. They understood surgery reasonably well. The army needed surgeons, but knew nothing of germ theory or infection control. Most medical treatment was useless or harmful. Yet for all its brutality, inequality, and disease, the Roman Empire at its height provided something unprecedented, a cosmopolitan world where people and ideas moved freely across vast distances. Greek philosophy, Jewish theology, Persian religions, Egyptian mystery cults all circulated and combined in creative ferment. Latin and Greek served as universal languages. Legal systems protected property and person, imperfectly but better than chaos. Infrastructure, roads, ports, aqueducts provided material foundation for prosperity. This was the world at its peak when Hadrian toured the provinces, when Marcus Aurelius wrote philosophy between battles, when the Pax Romana seemed eternal. The seeds of crisis were already planted: economic strain, frontier pressure, succession problems, climate stress, but they hadn't yet sprouted. To live then in the 2nd century CE was to inhabit a world that had forgotten it could end. But even this peak contained seeds of future problems. Trajan's eastern conquests proved impossible to hold. His successor Hadrian immediately withdrew from Mesopotamia, recognizing overextension. Hadrian consolidated frontiers, building walls in Britain and Germania. He traveled constantly, inspecting provinces and frontiers, the first emperor to spend more time touring the empire than residing in Rome. Hadrian's wall in northern Britain, 73 miles of stone fortification from coast to coast, symbolized something important about Rome's strategic situation. The empire had reached its sustainable limits. Beyond lay territories too poor, too hostile, or too far from the Mediterranean core to be worth conquering. Rome's strategic posture shifted from expansion to defense. The wall itself was an extraordinary engineering achievement. Built between 122 and 128 CE, it required millions of shaped stones, thousands of workers, and military garrisons to maintain. Every Roman mile featured a small fort called a mile castle. Between mile castles stood 2 observation towers. Behind the wall ran a military road allowing rapid troop movement. Larger forts housed garrison troops. The wall wasn't impermeable. It couldn't stop a determined invasion, but it controlled movement, regulated trade, collected customs, and projected Roman power into the northern wilderness. Hadrian understood that empire had limits. He also understood that Rome's strategic challenge had shifted. No longer was expansion profitable. Now defense was necessary. The frontiers, Rhine, Danube, Hadrian's Wall, the Syrian desert, marked where Roman civilization met its others. Maintaining those frontiers, keeping barbarians out and civilization in, became the imperial project. Marcus Aurelius, who became emperor in 161 CE, spent most of his reign fighting defensive wars on the Danube frontier. He wrote his Meditations, Stoic philosophical reflections, in military camps on campaign. The irony of a philosopher-emperor forced to spend his reign at war wasn't lost on Marcus himself. He described his frustration at being prevented from philosophy by the necessity of defending the empire. Marcus also faced something new: pandemic disease. In 165 CE, soldiers returning from eastern campaigns brought an epidemic, possibly smallpox or measles, that killed an estimated 5 to 10 million people across the empire. The Antonine Plague devastated cities, disrupted trade, weakened the army, and destabilized Rome's economy. It was Rome's first encounter with the kind of pandemic that would repeatedly hammer complex urban civilizations. The plague's effects rippled through Roman society. Labor became scarce, raising wages and creating inflation. Agricultural productivity declined as farmers died and fields were abandoned. Trade routes became transmission vectors, spreading disease wherever Roman roads and ships connected populations. Cities, with their dense populations and poor sanitation, suffered worst. Rome itself lost thousands daily at the plague's peak. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried or burned. Some historians argue the Antonine Plague marked the beginning of Rome's decline. The empire never fully recovered its pre-plague population. Economic disruption weakened the state's tax base. Military recruitment became difficult. The confident expansion of Trajan's era gave way to the defensive anxiety of Marcus Aurelius. Whether one plague could cause such effects is debatable, but the timing is suggestive. When Marcus Aurelius died in 180 CE, he broke the adoptive succession pattern by naming his biological son Commodus as heir. Commodus was 19, vain, cruel, and possibly mentally unstable. He imagined himself as the reincarnation of Hercules, renamed Rome Colony of Commodus, and fought as a gladiator in the Colosseum. The Senate and military leadership tolerated him for 12 years before conspirators strangled him in his bath on December 31st, 192 CE. What followed was another civil war. 5 men claimed the throne in 193 CE. Septimius Severus won, founding the Severan dynasty that would rule until 235 CE. On his deathbed, Severus allegedly told his sons, "Enrich the soldiers and scorn all others." This advice reflected a reality. Emperors ruled through military force. Keep the legions loyal and everything else follows. The Severan dynasty ended in 235 CE with the assassination of Severus Alexander. What followed was the crisis of the 3rd century, 50 years that nearly destroyed Rome. Between 235 and 284 CE, the empire had perhaps 26 recognized emperors and countless usurpers. Most died violently within a few years of taking power. The average reign lasted 2.5 years. Provinces broke away. Gaul, Britain, and Spain formed the breakaway Gallic Empire. Queen Zenobia of Palmyra conquered Egypt and much of the east, creating the Palmyrene Empire. Germanic tribes breached the frontiers, raiding deep into imperial territory. The economy collapsed. Emperors debased the currency to pay armies, causing runaway inflation. The silver content of Rome's denarius dropped from 87% under Marcus Aurelius to 5% by 260 CE. Trade declined. Cities shrank. In some regions, people abandoned currency entirely, reverting to barter. Plague struck again. The plague of Cyprian, beginning around 251 CE, killed thousands daily in Rome at its peak. This is the period that generated most of the 210 theories of Rome's fall, because it looks like the fall happening in real time. Climate data suggests cooling and increased aridity. Frontier peoples faced pressure from migrations further east and pushed into Roman territory. The military's demand for resources and the state's inability to collect taxes created a death spiral. Roman currency became worthless, urban populations declined. In many provinces, the central government simply ceased to function. Imagine living through this period. You might be a merchant in a provincial city. When you were young, Roman coins had value, trade was safe, and imperial administration was reliable. Now coins are worthless tokens. Trade routes are dangerous. The governor hasn't visited in years. Barbarian raids happen regularly. The city's population has halved. Buildings are abandoned. Nobody repairs the aqueduct. The emperor changes yearly and nobody knows who rules. This isn't theoretical decline. It's the collapse of civilization happening in your lifetime. Yet Rome didn't fall. Between 268 and 270 CE, Emperor Aurelian defeated the breakaway empires and reunified Roman territory. In 284 CE, Diocletian seized power and stabilized the empire through radical reforms. Diocletian created the Tetrarchy, rule of 4. he divided the empire into eastern and western halves, each governed by an Augustus with a designated junior emperor called a Caesar. The system distributed administrative burden and ensured succession wouldn't require civil war. Diocletian also reformed taxation, fixed prices by edict, reorganized provinces, and expanded the bureaucracy. He persecuted Christians, seeing them as threats to unity. He ruled from Nicomedia in Asia Minor, not Rome. After 20 years, in 305 CE, he voluntarily abdicated, the first emperor, to retire peacefully, since Augustus. The Tetrarchy collapsed into civil war within a year of Diocletian's retirement. From that conflict emerged Constantine the Found, who would transform Rome as profoundly as Augustus had. Constantine became emperor through the usual method, civil war. In 312 CE, marching on Rome to fight his rival Maxentius, Constantine reportedly saw a vision of the Christian cross with the words, "In this sign, conquer." Whether the vision happened is debatable. What Constantine did next wasn't. He put Christian symbols on his soldiers' shields, won the Battle of Milvian Bridge, and credited the Christian god with his victory. In 313 CE, Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, legalizing Christianity throughout the empire. This wasn't yet making Christianity the state religion that would come later, but it ended 3 centuries of intermittent persecution. Constantine went further, returning confiscated Christian property, funding church construction, and giving Christian clergy legal privileges. Why Constantine converted is debated. Personal conviction? Political calculation that Christianity's organizational structure made it useful for imperial administration? Both. Constantine wasn't baptized until his deathbed. He continued using pagan imagery, and his understanding of Christian theology was minimal, but his patronage transformed Christianity from a persecuted minority religion to an imperial favorite. Constantine made another momentous decision. In 330 CE, he moved the imperial capital from Rome to Byzantium, which he renamed Constantinople. The new city straddled Europe and Asia, controlled maritime routes between the Mediterranean and Black Sea, and was defensible against both northern and eastern threats. Rome remained symbolically important, but ceased being the functional center of government. Constantinople's founding marked a geographic shift in empire's center of gravity. Rome had always been oddly positioned, on the western edge of an empire whose richest provinces lay in the east. Alexandria, Antioch, Carthage, and the cities of Asia Minor dwarfed Rome in population and wealth. The empire's threats now came from the Rhine-Danube frontiers and from Persia. Constantinople, positioned between these threats, made strategic sense. The new city was built to impress. Constantine adorned it with artworks looted from across the empire. He built massive walls, a hippodrome for chariot races, palaces, churches, and administrative buildings. Constantinople would remain one of the world's great cities for over a millennium, surviving long after Rome itself had faded into relative insignificance. When Constantine died in 337 CE, Christianity was ascendant, but not yet dominant. His son Constantius II favored Christianity, but his nephew Julian, who ruled briefly from 361 to 363 CE, attempted to restore paganism. Julian failed. Christianity had captured the empire's administrative class and urban populations. In 380 CE, Emperor Theodosius I issued the Edict of Thessalonica, declaring Nicene Christianity the empire's official religion. Pagan temples were closed, pagan practices were outlawed, the transformation was complete. Christianity's rise changed Rome fundamentally. Classical Roman religion had been transactional, perform the proper rituals, receive divine favor for the state. Christianity demanded personal faith, exclusive devotion, and promised salvation or damnation based on belief. Christian bishops accumulated power, rivaling secular officials. Theology became a matter of imperial policy. Constantine himself convened the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE to resolve doctrinal disputes. Christianity also reoriented Roman values. Classical virtues, martial courage and glory, gave way to Christian virtues of humility, charity, and asceticism. Gladiatorial games, while not immediately ended, were increasingly viewed as barbaric. Monks and hermits became new models of holiness, rejecting the urban civic life Romans had traditionally celebrated. Whether this transformation strengthened or weakened the empire became one of those 210 theories. Christianity gave Rome a unifying ideology beyond mere power, or Christianity sapped Rome's martial spirit and diverted resources to ecclesiastical rather than military purposes. Theodosius then was the last emperor to rule a unified empire. When he died in 395 CE, he divided it permanently between his two sons, Honorius receiving the west, Arcadius the east. This division codified what had been increasingly apparent. The empire was too large, too diverse, and too threatened on multiple frontiers for single-person rule. The 5th century is traditionally presented as Rome's fall. This framing is both true and misleading. The Western Empire did collapse as a political entity, but the process was gradual, uneven, and not experienced by contemporaries as civilization ending. The Western provinces faced increasing pressure from Germanic peoples, Goths, Vandals, Franks, Burgundians, Sueves, Alemanni, and others. These peoples weren't savage barbarians suddenly appearing from darkness. Many had lived along Roman frontiers for centuries. Some had served in Roman armies. They adopted Roman administrative techniques, spoke Latin, and often converted to Christianity. They were migrating not to destroy Rome, but to enter it, to access its wealth and security. But the migrations were violent and destabilizing. In 406 CE, a coalition of Germanic tribes crossed the frozen Rhine into Gaul. In 410 CE, Visigoths under Alaric sacked Rome itself, the first time the city had fallen to foreign enemies in 800 years. The shock reverberated. Saint Jerome, writing in Bethlehem, lamented, "The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken." Yet Rome recovered. Alaric didn't destroy the city, he plundered it. Life continued. The Senate still met. The Western Emperor, Honorius, ruled from Ravenna. Visigoths moved into Spain. Vandals crossed into North Africa, establishing a kingdom centered on Carthage, the same Carthage Rome had destroyed 5 centuries earlier. The Western imperial government lost effective control of provinces without dramatically changing daily life in those provinces. A Gallo-Roman aristocrat whose estate was now notionally under Frankish rather than imperial authority still lived in a villa, spoke Latin, collected taxes, and administered local affairs much as before. Germanic kings typically maintained Roman administrative structures because they were useful. The Roman legal system, tax collection, Latin literacy all persisted. The Western Empire collapsed through a combination of military defeats, economic exhaustion, loss of tax base, and the Roman state's inability to maintain the army necessary to defend its frontiers. Each lost province meant fewer taxes. Fewer taxes meant smaller armies. Smaller armies meant less ability to defend remaining provinces. The spiral was irreversible once it began. By 450 CE, the Western Emperor controlled Italy and little else. The actual power in the West was Aetius, the last great Roman general who defeated Attila the Hun at the Catalonian plains in 451 CE. Then Emperor Valentinian III, jealous of Aetius's power, murdered him. Valentinian was himself murdered shortly after. Germanic warlords became kingmakers, installing and deposing puppet emperors. This brings us back to September 4th, 476 CE. Romulus Augustulus was installed as emperor in 475 by his father, a Roman general. Odoacer, a Germanic chieftain commanding the army in Italy, demanded land grants for his soldiers. Romulus Augustulus's father refused. Odoacer's troops mutinied, captured Ravenna, and deposed Romulus Augustulus. Odoacer sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, declared he would rule as king of Italy under the Eastern Emperor's nominal authority, and pensioned off Romulus Augustulus, who disappears from history. Contemporary sources barely mention the event. The Eastern Emperor Zeno recognized Odoacer's authority. The Senate continued, Roman law remained in force. Latin remained the administrative language. Former Western provinces were now ruled by Germanic kings, but those kings called themselves Roman officials, used Roman titles, and maintained Roman structures. So did Rome fall on September 4th, 426 CE. In one sense, yes, there was no longer a Western emperor. In another sense, no Roman civilization, institutions, laws, language, and even political forms continued. The transformation was political, not civilizational. This is why historians now often speak of Rome's transformation rather than its fall. But the Eastern Empire, which its inhabitants called the Roman Empire, and we call the Byzantine Empire, continued for another 1,000 years. Constantinople remained a great city. Byzantine emperors ruled territories in the Balkans, Greece, Anatolia, sometimes Italy, sometimes North Africa. They preserved Roman law, Greek learning, and Christian orthodoxy. They spoke Greek rather than Latin. Their culture diverged from the West, but they were Romans in their own understanding. The Byzantine Empire had its own crises, its own revivals, its own transformation. Justinian the Fair, who ruled from 527 to 565 CE, reconquered North Africa from the Vandals, Italy from the Ostrogoths, and parts of Spain from the Visigoths, briefly restoring something resembling the old empire's extent. He codified Roman law in the Corpus Juris Civilis, the foundation for continental European legal systems. He built the Hagia Sophia, which stood as the world's largest cathedral for nearly 1,000 years. But Justinian's conquests couldn't be held. New threats emerged: the Persian Sassanid Empire from the east, Slavic migrations from the north, and most devastatingly, Islamic conquests from the 7th century onward. The Byzantines lost Egypt, Syria, North Africa, and eventually held only Anatolia, Greece, and the Balkans. Yet they persisted, defending Constantinople against multiple sieges, preserving classical learning, and maintaining unbroken continuity with Rome's founding. On May 29, 1453 CE, Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II captured Constantinople after a 57-day siege. Emperor Constantine V Palaiologos died fighting at the walls. The city fell. The last Roman emperor was dead. The empire founded, by legend, in 753 BCE had ended after 2,206 years. This is the true end of Rome, not 476 CE, but 1453 CE. Byzantine preservation of Roman law, Greek philosophy, and classical texts meant that when Western Europe emerged from the early medieval period, it could recover the classical inheritance. The Italian Renaissance was sparked partly by Byzantine scholars fleeing Constantinople's fall, bringing manuscripts to Italy. Now we must confront the central question: why did Rome fall? Or rather, why have historians proposed 210 different answers? Start with military explanations. Rome fell because Germanic barbarians conquered it. This was the traditional narrative. Rome weakened, barbarians attacked, civilization collapsed. Edward Gibbon's The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, published 1776-1788, blamed Christianity for sapping Roman martial vigor and barbarians for delivering the final blow. But this explanation is insufficient. Germanic peoples had pressured Roman frontiers for centuries without breaking through. Why did defenses fail in the 5th century? And if military conquest explains the West's fall, how did the East survive the same pressures for another 1,000 years? The Germanic peoples who entered the empire in the 5th century often admired Rome and wanted to join it, not destroy it. The Goths who served in Roman armies, the Franks who adopted Roman administration, the Vandal kings who issued coins with Roman imagery. These don't fit a simple invasion narrative. Economic explanations followed. Rome fell because its economy collapsed. The crisis of the 3rd century showed how currency debasement, inflation, disrupted trade, and declining urban populations could cripple the state. The Western Empire in the 5th century couldn't collect enough taxes to maintain its army. Lost provinces meant lost revenue in an irreversible spiral. But economic explanations face the same problem. The East had the same economic system, the same currency crises, yet survived. Constantinople and the eastern provinces were wealthier, true, but that's describing the problem, not explaining it. Why did the East maintain its economic base while the West's crumbled? Environmental explanations have gained prominence recently. Paleoclimatology shows that the Roman climatic optimum, favorable temperatures and rainfall that supported Roman expansion, ended around 150–200 CE. Cooling temperatures, increased aridity in some regions, climate instability, all stressed Roman agriculture. Kyle Harper's The Fate of Rome emphasizes the role of pandemic disease, the Antonine Plague, the Plague of Cyprian, the Justinianic Plague, in killing millions and disrupting the economy. Climate and disease weren't the only factors. The Huns' western migration in the 4th century created a domino effect, pushing Germanic peoples into Roman territory. Those peoples weren't fleeing Roman power, they were fleeing Hunnic power, seeking refuge in Roman lands. Roman defenses, weakened by plague, climate stress, and economic strain, couldn't manage the influx. Political explanations focus on institutional failure. The Western Empire's inability to maintain stable succession created civil wars that consumed resources. The Eastern Empire developed more stable administrative structures and succession mechanisms. The division in 395 CE permanently separated richer eastern provinces from the West, ensuring the West would eventually lack resources to defend itself. Religious explanations point to Christianity's effects, positive or negative, depending on the historian's view. Did Christian emphasis on otherworldly salvation reduce civic commitment? Did Christian institutions provide social cohesion when secular structures failed? Did theological disputes weaken unity, or did Christianity provide the only institution that survived Rome's political collapse? All are arguable. Cultural explanations suggest Rome declined because Romans lost their civic virtue, their martial spirit, their cultural confidence. This was popular in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Rome fell because Romans became decadent, lazy, dependent on foreign soldiers. Modern historians largely reject this as circular reasoning that projects cultural anxieties onto the past. Here's what historians increasingly recognize. Rome's fall had no single cause. It was a cascading systems failure where multiple stresses interacted and amplified each other. Climate change stressed agriculture. Plague killed farmers and soldiers. Economic disruption reduced tax revenue. Reduced revenue meant smaller armies. Smaller armies couldn't stop invasions. Invasions reduced revenue further. Political instability consumed resources in civil wars. Loss of wealthy provinces impoverished the West while strengthening the East. Religious transformation created new social structures but disrupted old ones. And crucially, fall may be the wrong word. The Western Empire didn't vanish in 476 CE. Germanic kings ruled using Roman administrative structures. The Catholic Church preserved Latin learning and Roman institutions. Roman law influenced medieval law codes. Latin evolved into Romance languages. Cities shrank but didn't disappear. Trade declined but didn't cease. Material culture became less sophisticated. Literacy decreased. Long-distance trade diminished. But these were gradual changes over centuries, not sudden collapse. Peter Brown's influential work on late antiquity argues we should see this period as transformation, not decline. The Roman world evolving into the medieval world, changing its political forms while maintaining cultural continuity. The Eastern Empire's survival until 1453 supports this view. Rome didn't fall, it transformed gradually enough that people living through the change experienced it as continuity. But Brian Ward Perkins counters that focusing on continuity obscures real suffering. Archaeological evidence shows dramatic decline in material culture, complexity, and quality of life for common people. Sophisticated Roman pottery gave way to crude local manufacture. Roof tiles disappeared. People used thatch instead. The ability to build stone structures declined. This wasn't just political change, it was civilizational decline that impoverished people's lives. Both views contain truth. For Gallo-Roman aristocrats, the shift from imperial to Frankish rule might have been relatively smooth. For common people who lost access to manufactured goods, the transformation was impoverishment. The question is one of perspective and emphasis. So return to the fundamental question. Why did Rome fall? Because of climate, disease, political instability, economic crisis, military pressure, religious transformation, institutional failure, overextension, and loss of civic virtue, all interacting in ways that created irreversible decline in the West while the East survived. That's not one explanation, it's acknowledging that complex civilizations fail through complex processes that resist simple narratives. Which brings us to what Rome's story reveals about civilization itself. Rome showed that large-scale political integration is possible, that diverse peoples can be governed under common systems, that rule of law can work across cultures and languages, that infrastructure and administration can create stability and prosperity. At its height, the Mediterranean world enjoyed unprecedented peace, security, and economic integration. Rome also showed that such integration is fragile. It depends on maintaining military force, collecting sufficient revenue, managing succession, responding to climate and disease, and maintaining legitimacy. When these factors align, civilization flourishes. When they fail, civilization transforms or collapses surprisingly quickly. Rome demonstrated that conquest can create peace, but peace built on conquest is always unstable. The Pax Romana was real. Trade flourished, cities grew, people lived secure from banditry and war, but it was imposed by force and maintained by threat of force. The peoples on the receiving end experienced it differently than Romans did. Calgacus's alleged words to his troops that Romans created desolation and call it peace captured this tension. Rome's legacy includes both the aqueducts and the massacres, the law codes and the crucifixions, the roads that connected the Mediterranean, and the legions that enforced submission. Rome showed that legal systems can outlast political structures. Roman law influenced medieval law codes, the Napoleonic Code, modern civil law systems across Europe and Latin America. The distinction between criminal and civil law, concepts of property rights, contract law, legal procedure, Rome created frameworks still structuring modern life. The Corpus Juris Civilis, Justinian's codification of Roman law, completed in 534 CE, became the foundation for legal systems across Europe. It distinguished between jus civile, civil law applying to citizens, and jus gentium, law of nations, applying universally. It established legal personhood, property rights, contract enforcement, and procedures for resolving disputes. When medieval European states needed legal frameworks, they adapted Roman law. When revolutionaries drafted new constitutions, they referenced Roman precedents. When modern lawyers argue cases, they invoke concepts Romans developed 2 millennia ago. Consider property law. The Roman distinction between possession and ownership, between usufruct and full property rights, between personal and real property, these remain fundamental to modern legal systems. The concept of legal personhood, allowing corporations to own property and enter contracts, descends from Roman legal innovations. Contract law's basic principles, offer, acceptance, consideration, were refined by Roman jurists analyzing commercial relationships across the Mediterranean. Criminal law retained Roman influence longer in some places than others. The presumption of innocence, that accusers must prove guilt rather than suspects prove innocence, is sometimes attributed to Roman law, though Roman practice was less consistent than the principle. The distinction between crimes against the state and crimes against individuals, between public prosecution and private lawsuit, reflects Roman categories. Roman legal thinking emphasized precedent, logical analysis, and systematic codification. Legal questions should be answered by consulting established principles, reasoning by analogy, and creating consistent frameworks. This approach shaped Western legal education for centuries. Medieval universities taught Roman law as a living tradition. The rediscovery of Justinian's corpus in 11th century Italy sparked a legal renaissance that transformed European governance. But Roman influence extended far beyond law into language itself. Latin evolved into Romance languages: Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian, spoken by 900 million people today. These aren't dialects of Latin. They're Latin transformed through centuries of local evolution. The Latin spoken by soldiers on the frontiers diverged from classical Latin, incorporating local vocabularies and simplifying grammar. Regional variations became new languages, but their Latin ancestry remains obvious. Even languages not descended from Latin borrowed extensively from it. English, a Germanic language, has more words of Latin origin than Germanic origin thanks to Norman French and later learned borrowing. Scientific terminology, legal language, medical vocabulary, botanical names all draw heavily on Latin. A modern doctor writing a prescription uses Latin abbreviations. A biologist classifying species uses Linnean binomial nomenclature in Latin. A lawyer citing precedent uses Latin phrases. We can't escape Latin because it's embedded in how educated Europeans thought and wrote for 15 centuries after Rome's transformation. Greek remained the empire's other great language, dominant in the eastern provinces. While Rome provided political and military structure, Greek culture provided intellectual content. Educated Romans were bilingual. They wrote philosophy in Greek, poetry in Latin. They studied in Athens, collected Greek art, and employed Greek tutors for their children. This Greco-Roman fusion became Western civilization's cultural DNA. Roman engineering achievements remain visible across 3 continents. The Pont de Gare aqueduct in France stands nearly 50 meters tall, carrying water across a river valley with arches of precisely cut limestone fitted without mortar. It's been standing for 2 Saeuanzeren years. The Pantheon in Rome, with its 43-meter dome, was the world's largest concrete dome until the 20th century. It's still the world's largest unreinforced concrete dome, built with an ingenious mix of concrete that's lighter toward the top and a hole, the oculus, that reduces weight while admitting light. Roman concrete, opus caementitium, was a revolutionary building material. Romans discovered that mixing volcanic ash with lime and water created concrete that hardened even underwater and grew stronger over time. Modern scientists studying Roman concrete found it incorporates aluminum tobermarite, a rare mineral that forms as seawater interacts with the volcanic ash, actually strengthening the structure over centuries. Modern concrete degrades after decades. Roman concrete lasts millennia. Roman roads totaled perhaps 250,000 kilometers at the empire's peak, connecting every province with stone-paved highways built for military movement, but serving commerce equally. The saying, "all roads lead to Rome," was literally true. The road system radiated from the Miliarium Aureum, the golden milestone in Rome's forum, to the empire's furthest reaches. Many modern European highways follow Roman routes because Romans chose routes for the same reasons modern engineers do: the most direct path between important cities, avoiding difficult terrain. Roman urban planning gave cities throughout the empire similar layouts: a forum for public business, amphitheatre for games, theatre for plays, circus for chariot races, bath complexes for hygiene and socializing, temples for worship, aqueducts for water, sewers for waste. Cities from Britain to Syria shared recognizable structures because they shared Roman templates. When new cities were founded, Roman surveyors laid out streets in grid patterns, oriented north-south and east-west, with the Cardo and Decumanus main streets intersecting at the Forum. Water systems showcased Roman engineering sophistication. Aqueducts used gravity to maintain steady flow over kilometers, calculating gradients precisely. Some crossed valleys on massive stone arches. The Segovia Aqueduct in Spain stands 28 meters high with 166 arches, built without mortar, standing for 2 Wushuzeren years. Others ran underground or on low walls. The system supplying Rome itself eventually included 11 aqueducts bringing hundreds of millions of litres daily from sources up to 90 kilometres away. Public baths became centres of Roman social life. The baths of Caracalla in Rome covered 11 hectares, held 600 bathers, and included libraries, gardens and art galleries, along with the bathing facilities. The largest, the baths of Diocletian, could accommodate 3 Wushuzeren people simultaneously. Bath complexes demonstrated Roman technological sophistication, hypercoursed heating systems, waterproofing techniques, glass windows, and complex plumbing all working together. Military engineering was equally impressive. Roman legions were construction crews as much as fighting forces. They built fortified camps every night on campaign, surrounded by ditches and ramparts. They constructed siege works, towers, ramps, artillery emplacements to capture enemy fortifications. They built bridges across rivers, roads through mountains, and walls across frontiers. Military engineers developed sophisticated siege artillery, including ballistae that hurled stones and scorpiones that fired large arrows with force and accuracy. Yet for all their engineering prowess, Romans weren't scientists in the modern sense. They excelled at practical application, not theoretical understanding. They built magnificent arches and domes without understanding stress distribution. They created concrete without knowing its chemistry. They constructed aqueducts without fluid dynamics equations. Roman engineering was empirical, try what works, repeat it, scale it up. When it worked, they didn't much care why. This practical orientation characterized Roman culture broadly. Philosophy was for ethical guidance, not abstract speculation. History was for moral lessons, not objective truth. Literature served rhetorical education and entertainment, not experimental aesthetics. Romans were suspicious of purely theoretical knowledge. Theory should serve practice. Knowledge should be useful. This made Romans effective administrators and engineers, but less innovative than Greeks in pure science or philosophy. Rome produced no one equivalent to Plato, Aristotle, Euclid, or Archimedes. Roman contributions were jurisprudence, administration, engineering, and military organization, practical fields. Even Roman philosophy was imported from Greece, adapted to Roman concerns. Stoicism became Rome's dominant philosophy not because Romans invented it, but because its emphasis on duty, endurance, and civic virtue resonated with Roman values. Yet this practical orientation had advantages. Roman flexibility, their willingness to adopt what worked regardless of origin, made them effective empire builders. They borrowed Greek philosophy, Etruscan religious practices, Celtic metalworking, Germanic military tactics, Egyptian administration, and Persian court ceremonial. They synthesized these into something distinctly Roman, cosmopolitan, practical, enduring. Roman imperialism justified itself through the concept of bringing civilization to barbarous peoples. Romans genuinely believed they did conquered peoples a favor by imposing Roman law, building Roman infrastructure, and spreading Roman culture. The historian Pliny the Elder called Italy the land chosen by divine providence to civilize the scattered and barbarous tongues of so many nations by intercommunication of language to give civilization to mankind. From the Roman perspective, conquest brought benefits. Instead of tribal warfare, there was peace. Instead of local tyrants, there was law. Instead of poverty, there was trade. Instead of barbarism, there was civilization. That this civilization came at sword point, that peace meant subjugation, that law meant Roman law imposed on peoples with their own legal traditions. These contradictions didn't much trouble Romans. They saw their empire as natural, proper, destined by the gods. From conquered peoples' perspectives, Roman imperialism looked different. Celtic, Germanic, and other tribal societies had complex cultures, religious systems, social organizations, and legal traditions. Roman conquest destroyed these, replacing them with Roman alternatives. Languages disappeared. Religious practices were suppressed or syncretized with Roman gods. Social structures were disrupted. Legal systems were overwritten. Yet Roman imperialism created unintended benefits. By forcibly integrating the Mediterranean and much of Europe, Rome created a cosmopolitan world where ideas circulated freely. Christianity, born in Judea, spread along Roman roads using Greek language and Roman organizational structures, transforming from a Jewish sect to a universal religion. Stoic philosophy, developed in Athens, became Roman practical ethics. Egyptian mystery cults attracted adherents across the empire. Persian religious ideas influenced Mediterranean thought. This cultural exchange worked in all directions. Romans adopted trousers from Celts and Persians, finding them more practical than togas in cold climates. They incorporated foreign gods into their pantheon: Isis from Egypt, Mithras from Persia, Cybele from Anatolia. They hired Greek teachers, Syrian merchants, Germanic soldiers, African administrators. The empire was more multicultural than any previous Mediterranean power, creating social complexity that generated creative ferment. The question of whether Roman imperialism was, on balance, beneficial or harmful to conquered peoples is unanswerable because it depends on whom you ask and when. A Gallo-Roman aristocrat in the 2nd century CE, educated in rhetoric, prosperous from trade, secure under Roman law, might view Roman conquest of Gaul 4 centuries earlier as the best thing that ever happened to his ancestors. A Celtic druid, watching sacred groves cut down and traditional learning suppressed, would disagree vehemently. What's undeniable is that Roman imperialism created a world system that shaped subsequent history. The Mediterranean became culturally unified in ways it had never been and would never be again. Latin and Greek became universal languages. Roman law became a common framework. Christianity, emerging within this Roman-created cosmopolitanism, inherited Roman organizational structures and spread along Roman routes. When Rome's political unity fractured, cultural connections remained. Medieval Europe fragmented politically but retained Roman legal concepts, Latin literacy, Christian religion, and memories of Roman grandeur. The Holy Roman Empire, founded in 800 CE when Charlemagne was crowned emperor, claimed Roman continuity. Islamic civilization, conquering former Roman territories in North Africa and the Middle East, preserved Greek philosophy and science in Arabic translation. The Byzantine Empire maintained explicit Roman continuity until 1453. Every subsequent European empire, Spanish, Portuguese, British, French, Russian, modelled itself partially on Rome. Imperial capitals built triumphal arches and columned buildings echoing Roman architecture. Legal codes referenced Roman precedents. Official languages, even when not Latin-derived, borrowed Latin vocabulary. The concept of empire itself, a multi-ethnic political unit bound by law and ruled from a capital, was Roman. Even modern republics reference Rome. The United States Senate, French Republic, and countless other democratic institutions chose names deliberately evoking Roman precedent. Founding documents reference Roman history. Civic architecture mimics Roman styles. The very concept of republic, res publica, the public thing, is Roman. When revolutionaries overthrew monarchies, they often reached back to Rome's republican ideals, conveniently forgetting that the Roman Republic was oligarchic, expansionist, and eventually collapsed into autocracy. This selective memory of Rome reveals something interesting. Each era reshapes Rome to reflect its concerns. Renaissance humanists saw Rome as a model of classical learning. Enlightenment philosophers saw it as an example of republican virtue. Victorian imperialists saw it as justification for their own empire building. 20th century totalitarians, both fascist and communist, claimed Roman precedent. 21st century writers use Rome to discuss immigration, climate change, and imperial decline. Rome becomes a mirror. We project our anxieties and aspirations onto Rome's history, finding lessons that confirm what we already believe. Conservatives see Rome's fall as moral decay requiring traditional values. Progressives see it as inevitable transformation requiring adaptation. Environmentalists see climate stress and disease. Economists see fiscal crisis. Military historians see strategic overextension. Each finds evidence supporting their interpretation because Rome's history is complex enough to support multiple narratives. Rome demonstrated that technology and engineering can be lost. Romans built concrete that lasted millennia. Medieval builders couldn't replicate it. Romans built aqueducts with sophisticated hydraulics. That knowledge largely disappeared. Rome's roads lasted because they were so well built, but the ability to build such roads was lost. Civilization isn't inevitable progress. Knowledge can be forgotten, capabilities can decline. Rome revealed that disease and climate matter as much as politics and military strength. The Antonine Plague killed millions and contributed to Rome's 3rd century crisis. Climate deterioration stressed Roman agriculture precisely when political and military challenges increased. Modern climate change and pandemic disease make Rome's experience newly relevant. Rome showed that even powerful civilizations have limits. Trajan's conquests reached Mesopotamia, then Hadrian immediately withdrew, recognizing the territory couldn't be held. Rome's frontiers stabilized along natural boundaries, Rhine and Danube rivers, the English Channel, the Sahara, that marked the limit of sustainable expansion. Empires can become too large to govern effectively, too expensive to defend, too complex to administer. Rome demonstrated that religious transformation can happen within civilizations, not just between them. Christianity emerged within the Roman Empire, persecuted at first, tolerated later, eventually becoming the state religion. This transformation changed Roman culture fundamentally while maintaining political continuity. Modern debates about religious change in Western societies echo these Roman experiences. Rome showed that political systems evolved to meet circumstances, not abstract ideals. The Republic couldn't handle the problems created by Mediterranean conquest. It transformed into the Principate, monarchy disguised as Republic. This worked until it didn't, then evolved into the Dominate, open autocracy. Each transformation responded to specific pressures. Political systems are tools, not ends in themselves. Rome revealed that what we call civilization is partly storytelling. Romans told themselves they brought peace, law, and civilization to barbarians. Those barbarians often saw conquest and exploitation. Modern historians tell stories about Rome's fall that reflect their own concerns. 19th century fears of decadence, 20th century fears of totalitarianism, 21st century fears of climate change and pandemic. Rome becomes a mirror reflecting our anxieties about our own civilization. Finally, Rome showed that the question, when did civilization fall, often has no clear answer. Was it 476 when the last Western emperor was deposed? Was it 1453 when Constantinople fell? Was it gradual transformation across centuries? Was it the crisis of the 3rd century? Or did Roman civilization never truly fall but evolve into medieval and modern European civilization, its DNA still present in our languages, laws, and institutions? The answer depends on what you measure. Political unity, military power, economic complexity, material culture, legal systems, language, religion. different metrics give different answers. This is why historians have proposed 210 theories. They're measuring different things, emphasizing different evidence, asking different questions. What remains undeniable is that Rome's influence persists. Romance languages spoken by 900 million people descend from Latin. Legal systems worldwide trace ancestry to Roman law. Catholic Church structures preserve Roman administrative forms, architectural elements, arches, domes, columns, that Romans either invented or perfected appear in buildings on every continent. The political vocabulary we use, republic, senate, citizen, constitution, is Roman. Stand in Rome today, and you can still see the Colosseum, the Pantheon, the Forum, the aqueducts. These aren't just ruins, they're functioning parts of a modern city, integrated into contemporary life. The Pantheon is now a church, but its architecture is unchanged from when Hadrian dedicated it in 128 CE. You can walk on Roman roads, drink water from Roman aqueducts. Read Roman laws that still influence modern legal codes, or stand in Istanbul, Constantinople, and see how Byzantine walls, though breached in 1453, still define the city's geography. See the Hagia Sophia, built under Justinian, now a museum, testament to Rome's Eastern survival. The Ottoman Empire that conquered Constantinople saw itself as Rome's successor, calling its sultans Sultan of Rome, maintaining continuity with Byzantine administration. Rome didn't fall, it transformed gradually, unevenly, into something else. That transformation took different forms in different places. In Italy, it became Germanic kingdoms that maintained Roman structures. In Gaul, it became Frankish kingdoms that preserved Latin and Roman law. In Britain, Roman civilization largely disappeared, only to be reintroduced by Christianity. In North Africa, it became Vandal, then Byzantine, then Islamic. In the East, it remained explicitly Roman until 1453. The obsession with Rome's fall reflects modern anxieties about our own civilization's fragility. If Rome could fall, so can we. Every generation since Rome's transformation has asked what Rome's fall means for their society. Romans themselves asked it. Augustine wrote, "The city of God," partly in response to claims that Christianity caused Rome's decline. Medieval scholars asked it while living in Rome's ruins. Renaissance humanists asked it while recovering classical texts. Enlightenment historians asked it while debating progress. Victorians asked it while ruling their own empire. We ask it while facing climate change, pandemic disease, political polarization, and economic inequality. Rome provides no simple lessons. It shows that civilizations can last for centuries, but also that they can transform beyond recognition. That peace and prosperity are possible, but depend on factors beyond any individual's control. That human ingenuity can solve problems, but solutions create new problems. That culture can spread across vast territories, but integration is never complete. That legal and political systems matter, but so do climate, disease, and accident. Perhaps the real lesson is humility. Rome was the greatest empire of the ancient world, controlling territory from Scotland to Syria, maintaining peace and prosperity for millions across centuries. Romans believed their empire was eternal, destined by the gods, yet it transformed into something they wouldn't have recognized, not because of one great mistake or weakness, but through the accumulation of stresses that no system, however sophisticated, could indefinitely manage. We live in Rome's shadow, using its languages, governed by its laws, inspired by its achievements, warned by its failures. Every highway we drive is a Roman road spiritually, if not literally. Every legal contract invokes Roman precedent. Every marble-columned government building declares Roman influence. We can't escape Rome because it built too much, influenced too deeply, spread too far. The question isn't whether Rome fell, the question is whether Rome ever truly ended, or whether it simply transformed into the civilization we now inhabit. Standing in the Forum in Rome, you can see layers of history physically superimposed. Roman ruins, Medieval churches built into Roman temples, Renaissance palaces constructed from Roman stone, modern streets following ancient paths. It's a metaphor for how Rome actually works in history, not ended, but incorporated, not destroyed but transformed, not fallen, but evolved into the structures we mistake for our own original creation. The Western Roman Empire ended on September 4th, 476 CE, when Odoacer deposed Romulus Augustulus. Nobody noticed. The Eastern Roman Empire ended on May 29th, 1453 CE, when Mehmed II captured Constantinople. That they noticed, but Roman civilization, that stubborn amalgam of law, language, culture, religion, and institutions, never ended. It's still here, embedded in every Western legal system, every Romanced language, every classical building, every democratic institution that calls itself a republic or senate. Rome fell 210 different ways, according to historians. Rome never fell according to its own persistence. Both statements are true. This is why Rome matters, not because it succeeded or failed, but because it showed that success and failure are temporary categories imposed on processes that transcend them. Civilizations don't end, they transform. And the question isn't whether ours will fall, the question is what it's already transforming into, too gradually for us to notice, while we look backward obsessing over Rome's fall and forward fearing our own.